again, everyone. I invite you to take your seats because we will start with the next panel. This panel is quite interesting because, as I mentioned before, we are talking now for another part of the discussion. We talked before about women as survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Now we are talking about women as peace agents and women being part of peace negotiations and peace deals. If we can be a bit more silent, that we can hear the panelists, it would be very welcoming. I'm very honored to be here and to have these distinguished panelists to discuss this very important topic. In 2000, a landmark resolution passed, 1325, calling for women to be part of peace processes. But more than that, it called as well for peace agreements to have integration of gender perspective. So we are not only talking about participation as a number of women, but we are also talking about substantial contribution and gender perspective by taking into consideration that war is gendered, so should be peace. Data is all the time showing that when women are part of peace processes, the agreements are more durable. At the same time, the agreements are more inclusive. If we talk about numbers, and I want to share with you some numbers, women participation increases the probability of a peace agreement lasting at least 2 years by 20%, and a peace agreement lasting 15 years by 35%. Women are affected differently during the war, but at the same time, as agents, equal agents in society, they also contribute differently prior to the war, during the war, and after the war. All these contributions should be taken into consideration and should reflect in peace negotiations in decision-making processes. This is a topic of today, which I am very honored, again, to talk with a distinguished group of people who have been part directly of negotiations and who have dealt with peace processes throughout the years in the region and beyond. I would like, firstly, to welcome the U.S. Ambassador. Mr. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for accepting to be part of the panel. We have here with us as well the former Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister of Kosovo and Chief Negotiator, Madam Edita Tahiri. Thank you for coming, ma'am. We have with us as well the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Madam Melisa Radinaj. Thank you for being here. We are also well joined by Mr. Edward P. Joseph, lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, amongst others. And last but not least, we are joined as well by Mr. Jasmin Mujanovic, a political scientist who has been closely dealing with developments in the region. If I may start with some ground rules, I would like you to have your first remarks at around 5 minutes in order for us to have another round of questions of 3 minutes and then to hold the whole conversation in 1 hour. I know that you have a lot to say and the audience a lot to hear from you, so without further ado, I would like to go back to the Mr. Ambassador and go back to your speech in the first edition of Women Forum, Forum on Women, Peace and Security. You did recall a personal experience you had with Madam Secretary Albright and her leadership of how did she directly influence a situation, how she handled it. So put into the forefront the importance of women, but also the boldness and strength of women. So drawing from that and your experience, why do you think, Mr. Ambassador, that it's important to have women in peace processes and peace building? And at the same time, how can U.S. strategies be used in order to have women more being part of these processes, especially in regions where their role is marginalized?
Well, you have to thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers of this event, Mr. Prime Minister and others. It's a pleasure to be here. So I almost hesitate to answer or to be the person answering your first question of why is it important to include women in peace negotiation and peace building, and that this room is full of experts who can probably give better answers than I can. But I'm going to do what bold diplomats often do, and that is cite the President of the United States of America. On November 8th, 2023, the United States government adopted a strategy on women, peace, and security. And if you read that strategy, the very first thing is a letter from President Biden. And it's so appropriate that the very first sentence of his letter laying out this strategy is, quote, "My friend and former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, once said, quote, societies are more stable if women are politically and economically empowered," end quote. And that is a piece of it. Why does it matter? Because if we don't include women in peace negotiations and in peace building and in these processes, we are, first of all, there's just a fundamental issue of equity. We're excluding 50% or more of the population, but we're also making ourselves less adept, less able, less capable of dealing with the problems that we're trying to address. I'm going to continue quoting President Biden with the boldness that a good diplomat brings. He says later on in his letter, "Beyond the moral imperative to advance gender equity and equality around the world and beyond clear notions of right and wrong, we know that societies do better when women participate. Economies grow, education rates and health outcomes increase, political instability and extremism decline. When women are fully engaged in building and maintaining security in their countries, we see more sustainable outcomes, including less conflict and longer-lasting peace agreements. Put simply, the status of women and girls and the stability of nations are irrevocably linked." Now, I want to note a couple of things, because I believe that, and I believe that strongly, and I'm so proud to be the personal representative of a president of the United States who would articulate that both so clearly and so well. But I do have to note that in the years since 1325 was adopted, we're now in 2024. The last numbers I have are from 2022. Women represented only 16% of negotiators in active peace processes led or co-led by the United Nations. No women were included in negotiating teams for conflicts in Ethiopia, Myanmar, Sudan, or Yemen, or in the Balkans. So it's appropriate reminding ourselves, as you did, of the first forum 18 months ago or so. And I don't know how many remember Monica McWilliams' deep, searching, powerful presentation. It was really very, very challenging to speak right after her. But her question is, where are the women? And her discussion of what it meant. I see a lot of pictures, photos from meetings convened under the auspices of the EU, of the UN, and others, and I see a stark lack of gender representation. And here, on this set of issues, with the exception of President Osmani, we got to go pretty far down our list before we get to a woman who's directly or indirectly involved in the Kosovo-Serbia negotiations, either from the facilitators, the supporters, or the parties themselves. Now, that hasn't always been the case, and we're going to hear from Edita about her time, and we're going to hear from Elise about her time, but I think we have talked about the case now, and we have to acknowledge it. This doesn't mean that men aren't qualified. I hope we are. But it does mean that without this representation, without a diversity of experiences, of views, without bringing in the strength of our society and our organizations, we're handicapping ourselves. So there's good practical reasons. There's good, what I would call, issues associated with ethics, associated with why we want to have inclusive processes. So that was the first part of your question. I don't know how much time I have left of my 5 minutes. The second part of what can we do about it, and that is a harder question in some ways. I think we should all agree with what I just said as to why it is desirable. And I think we all agree on that. The question is, how do you put that into practice, and how do you move from a motivation or a understanding of a principle to actually doing the hard work of putting that principle into action? These are political choices, right? So there's the combination of citizens electing people who will say things and mean things and act in ways like President Biden does. There's also the question of our being attentive to this. So the United States cannot make choices for Kosovo or Serbia or other countries in the region. There are times when we kind of wish we might be able to at moments, but that is not how it works, and that isn't how it should work. The people of Kosovo control their own destiny, and we're proud of the role we've played in supporting that happening. But we can give our advice, and we can model. We're not the best examples of this ourselves. I mean, Secretary Blinken has made very clear how much he wants the Department of State to be an enterprise that reflects the diversity of American society. I think Secretary Blinken would be the first person to tell you that that remains a fundamental goal and that we have fallen short thus far in realizing that goal completely. We've done better, but we are not where we need to be. So I think from an external perspective, we can try to encourage, model, create programs and processes like an MOU we signed earlier today in support of the people of Kosovo to set up a center of excellence in women, peace, and security issues. I think we can draw attention to it, things like this initiative by President Osmani and the people of Kosovo. And I think we just have to acknowledge this is something that requires more attention and requires more of us speaking out. One last point. I was asked why I was going to be on a panel since this was a women's issue at one point by someone. And I was really delighted to say it is not. Of course it's not. It's a human issue. And it's a fundamental issue. I want a successful process of Kosovo-Serbia dialogue resulting ultimately in mutual recognition between two states. That's what needs to happen. And we're not going to get there without bringing our very best teams and negotiating in good faith. I think there also is a place, as some people spoke about earlier today, of men championing these issues as well. And I hope to be one of those champions. I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Now I would like to turn to one of the women who was leading the peace process, one of those leaders that were not even in the Western Balkans, because if we see in the last 20, 30 years, there have been 10 peace processes, only one of them has been led by a woman. Madame Dita Tahiri, you have been involved in this process for a long time, even in peace making in 80s and 90s. Can you share with us your experience? What does it mean to be a woman leading a peace process? And at the same time, can you share with us how can we overcome the challenges and the barriers that are often put in front of women who tend to be, or the topic of why women are important to be part of the peace processes?
Thank you, Jetta. First, would like to thank our Prime Minister for introducing us. Thank you very much. And I have a message for you, Prime Minister. Next time you are in the Security Council, you should ask international justice for our women victims of rape during the war in Kosovo. Because, Prime Minister, we are doing a lot. I have done, as you know, even petition organized, citizen petition all over Kosovo. Was glad, mostly men sign, but it's not enough. Our voice is not reaching where it should be heard. I must tell you that I recently wrote another letter to Guterres, Secretary General, calling for international justice, not only for Kosovo, but also Bosnia and Croatia, but not even answer. Thank you. Sorry, Jetta, a little diversion, but it was my opportunity to meet our Prime Minister. Now, back to your question, where, first of all, let me say that in this sad picture of discrimination of women everywhere in the world, Kosovo makes difference. Kosovo is the only country which had women in the Rambouillet Peace Conference where we decided peace. We were good negotiated, made our allies, strategic allies, Americans. Honored to be with Ambassador of America, who decided to use force through NATO, bombing Serbia, stopping genocide in our country, bringing peace, and we succeeded to leave the door open to independence, and I was only woman among 15 men, so Kosovo made difference. Another difference, Kosovo had woman chief negotiator in Brussels dialogue, Serbia did not have. So when I speak of dramatic underrepresentation of women in formal peace processes, I always make distinction of my country, young, visionary, I would say breathing democracy, respecting women, I hope will be better in the future. Now, why we don't see women in formal peace processes? It is related directly to under-empowerment of women in politics. Because to be able to be chosen or nominated to be in the formal peace tables, you women need to have political power. I told you I was in Rambouillet. I was again chief negotiator. Why? Because when my country got occupied, I took a role myself, become one of the founders of the movement for independence and freedom. Didn't wait it somebody to call me to join in that hard times of occupation from Serbia, but I came from the family who was patriotic. My father was in prison in the hard times of Rankovic, for those who knows, for ex-Yugoslavia. Ended up in jail because he stood up to defend the rights of Albanians. So same came to me as a feeling, patriotic feeling, and I became actor immediately. I became in the top leadership of the movement. Hence, I also got the seat in the delegation of Kosovo in Rambouillet. So my message is, and not only here, everywhere I speak, including the panel of UN Women 3 years ago, I said, empowering women in politics, investing in women in politics, we come to the terms of what? Sharing power with men. Ambassador said women are not the issue. I would like to say, Ambassador, men are the issue. Because men are dominating politics, dominating institutions, dominating delegations in Brussels dialogue, not only Kosovo, Serbia too. So, time has come to gender equality in politics. Through that comes the gender equality in the decision making. Hence, we have ensured women in the peacemaking, informal peace processes. If we cannot speed up with implementation of WPS agenda, which is delaying, isn't it? Isn't it today 23 or 20-year implementation is delaying? I would like to tell you our experience when we returned from the war, as we were exterminated by Milosevic. We started the life in free Kosovo. What I saw, men running for power. Women put aside. I personally know, because I already had high credibility in politics, so I was not the one targeted to be marginalized. What I did, I initiated the quota for women in parliament with whom, not alone, with grand coalition between women in politics and civil society in Kosovo, even wrote to the State Department, and we got quota. We still have quota. We have law on equality, but it's still not implemented. But why I'm mentioning quotas? We need now quotas at the world level and national levels. Each delegations of each states in the peace process, it must have quota in delegation for women. Even mediators must have quota. Look, Borrell, men, Lajčák, men. Okay, say it, Balkans couldn't put women, Kosovo or Serbia, but EU, our model for European and democratic values, Borrell men, Lajčák men. In my time, only Ashton was woman, others men. So here I want to finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Tahiri. I would like now to go to another woman, to Madame Elisa Radina, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kosovo. While you were the foreign minister at the same time, there were discussions now under the US and at the same time under EU facilitation in order to reach comprehensive agreement, because at that point we were still talking about comprehensive, legally final agreement. Based on your experience as being the head of the foreign policy, how can we use the diplomatic mission and foreign policy initiatives in order to advance gender equality agendas in conflict resolution efforts, but also in increasing the participation of women in peace processes?
Thank you very much, Jeta. I am indeed both honored and it's a pleasure to be here among very distinguished guests and panelists. I also want to applaud Madam President Vjosa Osmani for not only putting Kosovo on the map of the WPS agenda, but also leading with Kosovo at the forefront of the agenda with this forum and with these discussions that we are having here. I have to be honest that gender classified discussions were not a preferential angle for me until I reached a point in public service and in politics where I climbed the ladder and I found myself in a very lonely position surrounded by men. And it was only when I approached the decision-making tables where natural topics reserved for men, such as defense policies, such as foreign policies, such as geopolitics of war, peace and reconciliation, were discussed only by men. So it was only then that I had to rethink my, initial thoughts of, having thought in the beginning that classification on gender and discussing based on gender about policy issues will create division in the first place and will be counterproductive to the equality and to the equity and equal opportunities that we all aim. So it was only then when I thought that there's a large place in the decision-making table and in peace processes for women, for fellow women to be there, to have their voice, to amplify their voice and their rights and their opinions, and to fill that place where they belong. Unfortunately, even when I was a minister for a very short time and there were comprehensive discussions going on for a final mutual recognition agreement potential between Kosovo and Serbia, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was not included, and it still isn't, in the dialogue process, despite the fact that a dialogue with Serbia and a potential peace agreement between Kosovo and Serbia are the main foreign policy goal of the Republic of Kosovo, and that the absence of peace between Kosovo and Serbia is a main threat to the security situation in Kosovo. So it was not by function that I became involved in the dialogue, nor by meritocracy, but I had to, in a way, impose myself in that decision-making table dominated, I repeat, I highlight and underline, only by men. So when I sensed that it was not enough, that my voice was not heard enough in that delegation, I searched and sought different alternative means to have my voice heard. Unfortunately, it was COVID and traveling was not permitted, but I managed with the then Ambassador Kosnet, US Ambassador, to plan and to realize a visit at the United States where I thought it was imperative to say my opinions and my thoughts on what the comprehensive agreement, which was due to happen at the White House at the time, should address. And what happens if what shortcomings happen when those important issues are left out of the negotiating table, are left out of a potential agreement, and are not treated in any way between the two countries that are aiming a potential peace agreement. I remember meetings with the National Security Council, with close advisors to the then President Trump, with a presidential envoy as well, and also with the EU counterpart, which were not so coordinated at the time. And I wanted to make sure that Serbia should not get away with the illegal campaign of de-recognition of Kosovo. It should not get away by not implementing the first ever agreement that was reached, that was brokered by Madam former Deputy Prime Minister Edita Tahiri, which is the IBM agreement, and that Serbia wants to have this volatile border with Kosovo so that it has an open door to constantly and continuously destabilize the Republic of Kosovo via volatile borders. And also the fact that Kosovo is missing on international recognition, universal recognition, 5 EU non-recognizers. So these are the things that I mentioned that the agreement, the Washington agreement, should address. And in a way, I did my alternative way of influencing the decision-making process when I thought and I sensed that I'm not being heard enough from the national delegation team in Kosovo. So it was very, not comforting, but it was very, I was pleased to see the first draft of the Washington Agreement, which included not the 5 EU non-recognizers, but the Israel recognition. It stopped for a year, though, the illegal de-recognition campaign of Serbia that was running against the sovereign independent Kosovo. And also the fact that Merdore Common Crossing Point, which was part of the IBM agreement, was functionalized for the first time with the Washington Agreement. So in this way, I thought that I gave my indirect contribution to the dialogue. And of course, I did, before leaving the US, I forgot to mention, I met Madame Tahiri and consulted her. And always, every step of the way, she was an inexhaustible source of guidance and strength to us and to other women that were involved in the dialogue process. So with the roadmaps and guidelines, or thoughts on how to improve and how to increase, we will do it in the second round. But I think there is a lot of space for women and a lot of potential and opportunities for women to find their way, not only in the negotiating table, not only at the forefront of where decision-making happens, but also in the background with consulting and with informing the decisions and just communicating and talking honestly about what the voice of the women is in relations to the dialogue and the peace processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing this very personal journey, and also for offering not only your personal journey, but offering also an example of how sometimes when you don't have a chair on the table, you bring your own chair and you sit in the table. So thank you for that. And now I will go, Mr. Joseph, are you okay with giving? Oh, okay, great. Then I will go to the lecturer of Johns Hopkins University, Mr. P. Joseph. We talked about the research and empirical evidence saying that when we have more women, the agreements are lasting longer and are more comprehensive. I would like to ask you, how do we take these insights to inform policy and practice for all stakeholders which are involved in the process? But at the same time, coming from your experience in different conflicts in the Balkans, I would like to ask from you, how do you consider the design of a peace process, the very design of how the peace process can determine the role of women, but also the actors, right? Mediators, negotiators, political parties, experts. The floor is yours.
Jutta, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to addressing those questions. I first have to say how wonderful it is not just to be on this panel, but to be on this panel with two fellow SAIS alumni. So Edita Tahiri and Jutta, so really a special occasion. And permit me, please, 3 very brief acknowledgments. First, I have to acknowledge an extraordinary woman, and that is my wife, Eva. who is originally from Osijek, Croatia, and is a wonderful role model to our daughter and our son. So I acknowledge her. Second, I owe special gratitude to even being here today to my friend, the former Defense Minister of Albania, Fatmir Mediu, who remains a leader on NATO issues and on NATO values, which is so important. And finally, I want to thank President Osmani for her extraordinary leadership globally on women, peace, and security. So, I thank her for this invitation. Now, you mentioned the past. So what I would say here briefly, Jette, is I would have 3 points. One is to delve in to my experience in the region during the wars, talk about the past a little bit, then see where we are in the present, and then finally, I would look into the future. I actually have a concrete answer, a suggestion to Ambassador Hovenier's question about how to translate. Okay, all right, very well. So we'll wait on that. But I do have that. So let me speak to the question here, and I think Edita alluded to this, is the absence of women. I have to tell you, in a decade here, from 92 to 2003 actually, in all conflict areas, from Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, here, Kosovo, and then Macedonia, I honestly and sadly have to acknowledge that I do not recall encountering a woman in a significant, let's call it, political role in that period. And of course, we know during that period that women suffered tremendously. But women have agency, and they're not only victims. And it wasn't really till after the war, and I'll mention how, when I first became acquainted with the need and the capacity to involve women. But I have to tell you, honestly, I was trying to think, and I could not think of a single encounter. And of course, I was exposed to the question of conflict-related sexual violence in Tuzla in July '95, when the women who were expelled from Srebrenica with their children had been traumatized, deeply traumatized. And this was, I can remember, I don't have time here to give some graphic examples of how that was manifested there in the camp, but that experience, in a way, was very valuable to me, because within 10 days or 2 weeks later, I was in Žepa, face-to-face with Ratko Mladic, Zdravko Tolomir, Milan Guerrero, and others, evacuating, coordinating with my colleague as a UN Civil Affairs officer, this evacuation of Žepa, simultaneously with the genocide in Srebrenica. So that was a primary concern, was how to signal to the Serbs, to this senior Bosnian Serb leadership, that we were aware and we were going to do everything we could to let them know that we were watching, and we in this chaotic, incredibly stressful July scene, we tried to let them know ostentatiously that we were taking every woman's name down, and that we had colleagues where the buses were going to be dropped, that they would be also checking these names. So this was very much on our minds, and of course, after the war, we know that in terms of justice, it's been sadly completely inadequate. I mean, there's been some justice, but I will give you just a quick real-life situation. I was in Brčko just a few years ago and met with some women survivors of conflict-related sexual violence from the war, who told me that the perpetrators of these acts were walking freely in Brčko. I mean, can you imagine that? It's bad enough to suffer the trauma, a lifelong trauma, but to have that, and this was really deeply upsetting to hear that. Then let me quickly pivot to our post-war work in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I was with IFOR and assigned to OSCE, and I made a special point of meeting and engaging Esma Palic, who is the widow of Colonel Avdo Palic, very likely the highest-ranking prisoner of war taken during the war by the Bosnian Serbs and executed by the Bosnian Serbs, and working with her to try to get international community to press the Serbs to return her husband's remains, at least. And when I witnessed her poise, intelligence, and capacity, then it became graphically aware to me about what was missing all this time and the absence of women throughout this period. So that became very clear. Then within, I have to tell you, Edita mentioned quotas. I think great credit goes to the OSCE mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina under the leadership of someone who I'm sure Ambassador Hovenier remembers, the wonderful Bob Froelich, wonderful diplomat, and who insisted on these first elections, despite all the controversy and so forth, absolutely insisted on strict quotas. And I remember there was a lot of controversy about that. Yet it succeeded, and you see Edita tells, and this is where I would quickly pivot to the present, and then we'll come back later on the future and my concrete suggestion. But the present is we have this paradox, which is this is an issue, women, peace, and security, which actually is widely recognized as Ambassador Hovenier said. This is tremendously important construct. It's a policy framework that's been formalized. Prime Minister Kurti mentioned Security Council Resolution 1325, and Ambassador Hovenier mentioned, for example, in the United States, there's even legislation. Republicans and Democrats have backed legislation. So there are some formal steps, and yet we all know, that the progress is inadequate, way inadequate, for the very fact that, as Edita mentioned, we still need quotas. So without wanting to take too much time, I could go on, but I'll wait for the second round and give you my concrete suggestion for how to advance this and begin to resolve this paradox. Thank you very much.
Thank you likewise. I think that speaker after speaker, you are bringing a very rich experience, in which way you are highlighting what are the challenges, but also what are the ways or how to break these challenges. So thank you very much. Now I want to go to Jasmin Mujanovic. Jasmin, you are a political scientist, and you have been very closely monitoring, looking at political developments in the whole region. You are very actively discussing about different issues and how to improve, actually, all the processes that are going on in the region. I would like to ask you to share with us what are your thoughts on where do women stand now in the region when it comes to their representation in general in decision-making processes, but most specifically in peace processes, and how can we ensure that women are more involved in peace processes, and why? Why do you think that women should be there? Jasmin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you also to the Prime Minister for mentioning the Srebrenica genocide, and thank you also to the entire cohort of Kosovar officials here who have really done a lot to speak out about some of the issues in Bosnia, and I hope my friends in Sarajevo will replicate the favor, although obviously and very shamefully Bosnia-Herzegovina does not recognize the sovereignty of the Republic of Kosovo, but unfortunately we know why that is. It's a very good question that you have, and if you had asked me this question maybe 3 years ago, I think I probably would have given you a more positive answer than the one that I'm about to give you. Notwithstanding this very important conference and all the efforts that are being undertaken here, I think broadly speaking, the region as a whole is moving in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, that also includes the policy direction of our most important friends and allies in the political West, including in the EU and the US. We have a very particular problem, unfortunately, in the Western Balkans. And that is namely the insistence on ethnic-based solutions to political problems. We know, obviously, that sectarian and nationalist leaders want to have relevant political issues resolved through the prisms which they advocate for. So they want national and ethnic and sectarian solutions. But we also know, and I think both folks in the policy community and people in academia know, that these kinds of approaches do not produce good governance, they do not produce representation, they do not produce inclusivity. So we know, generally speaking, that women in virtually all societies, including in the most advanced democracies, still continue to face systematic barriers to participation and inclusion in the political process. That process of inclusion and representation gets even more difficult and pronounced anytime you introduce any kind of additional barriers to participation. And so in the Western Balkans, and I think unfortunately, Bosnia-Herzegovina in this regard is probably the most acute example of this. When you create an entire political regime that operates on the basis of sectarian identity or sectarian expression, that means that a whole cohort of people is excluded from the political process. Oftentimes, women and girls first and foremost. There is a reason why Bosnia has the most hardline sectarian regime in the world, and it has some of the lowest rates of women's representation in politics to accompanying that, right? And so the kind of real upshot of this, though, is that this is not just a kind of, generic problem. I think the thing to really emphasize here is that when those of us in the political West who benefit from living in liberal, cosmopolitan, multicultural societies that have taken great strides towards inclusion and participation, when it comes to our engagement in regions like the Western Balkans, we should champion those values because we know they are successful. We know ultimately they are the only things that are successful. In this sense, I am a little bit of an ideologue in the sense that I do believe very objectively that liberal democracy is the most optimal form of governance for human beings yet devised. Maybe in a couple centuries we'll come up with something better. We've yet to stumble upon it, however. So here's the thing. When we then turn to policy, Western policy in places like Kosovo or Bosnia, and the thing that Western officials want to talk about are ethnic-based solutions or ethnic-based paradigms, that means that space is being taken away from more important issues. Issues like the representation and participation of women and girls in politics. Because when we spend time talking about the ASM, or we talk about any number of other sort of sectarian hobgoblin formulations that we have a myriad of in Bosnia-Herzegovina, that is space that is finite. We do not have an infinite spectrum of time to resolve these issues. So every time we choose to speak about something that is not about empowerment, inclusion, and participation, we are losing time. And we can measure that loss of time in the Western Balkans in a very tragic way. We can measure it through the rates of emigration. And this is sort of the last point that I'll make, which is that all the time that we have spent over the last 20, 25, 30 years in this region, seeking continuously to find exclusionary solutions, i.e. ethnic solutions, has been wasted time. And I can tell you that because any one of us can go to Berlin, or we can go to Sydney, or we can go to Stockholm,
and we will encounter there hundreds of thousands of young people from Kosovo, from Bosnia, from Serbia, from North Macedonia, etc., because they did not want to wait any longer to see the magical results of exclusionary solutions, because they know it won't work. And so they went to the places that succeeded with open, cosmopolitan, democratic, liberal solutions.
Thank you, Yasmin. I'll follow up with another question, because now I want to do the second round of questions. We don't have too much time, so please be short. We did talk previously about the importance of not having a top-down approach when we talk about peace processes, but also bottom-up. You did talk about how your vision or your opinion or your view on how ethnic-based solutions are not the RIP one, and they are also excluding the representation, inclusion, and participation. Now, can you very shortly, talk as well about the importance of having different stakeholders from the bottom, from grassroots, involved into peace processes, and how to ensure that politics and political parties do not become a barrier to having them on board? 2 minutes, Yasmin.
So it's very simple. I think and here I'll say something. The danger about us talking through very simple lenses, like for instance ethnicity or even gender, is that we erase the complexity and multiplicity of human beings. A woman that comes to a position of power, and we've heard from two esteemed colleagues here today, also has this baggage coming with her, because she is forced to, in male-dominated spaces, not just represent women, but almost in every instance represent all of the other identities that she is aware are not being represented, right? So it's not just about, hey, oh, I'm a woman, so let me speak on behalf of all womankind. It's going to be about the fact that, look, a woman has one experience, but if she's a Romani woman, she's going to have a still different perspective. If she's a Romani woman who happens to be disabled, she's going to have a still third experience. If she's a Romani woman who happens to be disabled and also a gay woman, she's going to have a still fifth experience. So the reason why we need to emphasize inclusivity and participation is because we need to adequately represent the complexity of actually existing human beings and citizens. And this is why participatory-based solutions, and there are modalities ranging from what's called participatory budgeting to civic assemblies and all the rest of it, they create spaces and opportunities for us to reflect the complexities that exist in these societies. Very simply, in a place like Kosovo, it's not just about Albanians and Serbs, right? It's not, because that's not the only human beings who live here, and those are also not the only human beings, even if they are Serb or Albanian, that's not their only relevant political identity or social identity. So those are the spaces and opportunities we need to create to hear those voices, because that will also create new solutions that we will never encounter if we close off space.
I see that Edward is like nearly moving from his seat because he wants to take the floor, right? If I'm not, okay. Because I thought, okay. Your 2 minutes about the future, your golden ticket of how we can have
Yes.
more women in the U.S. strategy.
I will come to the future in a second. And let me just say that I think participatory models are great. And also, we've seen actually that ethnic-based models have made a major contribution in the region in taking the people of this region away from fighting and killing and conflict-related sexual violence. Let's stay with our theme here on women, peace, and security. And I'll give two examples which are right next door. The Ohrid Agreement, and by that I mean the original Ohrid Agreement, not the unsigned Ohrid Agreement, but the original Ohrid Agreement, which has resolved the conflict between ethnic Albanians and Macedonians, and it's an ethnic-based agreement. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And they have a vibrant democratic scene and a lot of political activity with elections coming up, and we'll see how that will play out next door. Also, the Erdut Agreement, completely ethnic-based, but look at the situation in Croatia today. The only Serb diaspora that is completely integrated into the society, does not listen and bow to the demands of Belgrade. So we should be careful before we make sweeping remarks about that. And we should remember that democracy, the fundamental principle of democracy, what is it? Consent of the governed. So when existing peace agreements, however flawed, are present, we have to reform them, and they demand reform. Definitely, the Dayton Agreement has to be reformed. Deeply flawed agreement, unnecessarily flawed agreement. The way, the pathway to reform, through consent of the governed. Now, at 1 minute, now let me pivot to our topic here, and just quickly mention, just because it came up, that the solution really to the region is the non-recognizers. And it's the 4 NATO non-recognizers, as I've written it with colleagues, including from Kosovo and Serbia, in our SICE report From Crisis to Convergence. So I encourage you to read that. That is really the key to the entire region. In terms of the future, and answering Ambassador Hovhanni's important question, which is how to move from to achievement. The answer is we have to show respect for women who are leaders, who are embodying and modeling the values that we want. And one of those women, in my view, is President Vjosa Osmani. And in my view, the U.S., in addition to all these formal steps it's taken in implementation of UN Resolution 1325, in my view, there's a very quite concrete step that the administration, that President Biden himself could do, which is to invite President Osmani to the White House and have a meeting in the Oval Office and discuss these issues. And as a gesture, President Biden could be showing his respect for a leader on these issues, and they could actually discuss how imperative it is to advance the roles of women, not only in the United States and Kosovo, but globally.
Thank
Please.
you. Thank you very much. And Ambassador, to follow up maybe to the contribution of Edwards, what could the U.S. strategies be in order to push forward more women in order to surpass these barriers, these challenges in general?
I know we're very low on time, so just a couple of things. One, I do want to just briefly note that I believe strongly and have been committed in the various jobs I've worked on in my career on Kosovo to advance a sovereign, democratic, multi-ethnic state and society. And I believe that is the foundation of American foreign policy on Kosovo. So I'll leave that one there. We have a strategy, as I said, and our strategy, which is a national strategy, lays out some lines of effort that are incredibly relevant to the things we can be doing to advance the status of women globally while it is a national strategy. But we talk about participation, both internal to the United States, but we have all kinds of programs to try to seek and support preparation and participation of women and girls in civic and political leadership. USAID and other programs very involved in that. Protection, a lot of our assistance is to protect human rights of women and girls and others around the world. Relief, response, recovery, this is less getting people at the negotiating table, but making sure that the most vulnerable get adequate resources. Last thing I will say, we have 5 lines of effort. I'm going to skip one, but the 5th one is partnerships, and we saw a visible manifestation of that today with the concluding of the MOU to support the Kosovan establishment of the Center of Excellence on Women, Peace, and Security. I think it is actions like that. I think there is no one big bang. I think it is changing attitudes. I think it is helping ensure that capable men and women, but with a big focus on women given their underrepresentation, do not face impediments or barriers to opportunity, and being champions for them, for those of us who are in the IN Club, and making the club bigger and broader and more expansive is the answer. But it is a long-term process. I mean, again, I don't want to suggest, therefore, everybody be patient and don't demand any change. Please demand change now, but acknowledge that this is going to take some time. It is a process.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, talking about a process, I'll go back to Madame Tahiri and speak about how to make the peace process more inclusive, in a sense, not having women, but also more to the peace agreements to have this gender perspective. I did talk about the design of a peace process. You've dealt with peace processes, you have negotiated. So can you tell us how the design of the peace process influences this? What's the space there or the lack of space?
Thank you, Yeta. I will lead a little aside this issue, gender issue, because situation is much more serious in the Brussels dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, because virtually Brussels dialogue is dead now. The fact that since last year, when this Ohrid implementation agreement was reached, there is zero implementation of any agreement by both sides. Why? Because the dialogue has come to final stage. What is final stage in negotiations? It is the time when both parties to be prepared for big exchange. And we have come to that position, but there is no move neither from Kosovo side nor from Serbian side. Kosovo on its side has an obligation, association of Serb majority municipality. Serbia on the other side has an obligation to recognize de jure Kosovo as a state. However, sorry to say, lately I hear all international players, all our allies even, America, Europeans, only call on Kosovo for association. None of them is calling on Serbia for recognition of Kosovo state. And it's not the first time I am saying, I am posting, I am giving interviews. I just want once again to say, because I have experience, at least in terms of how to push processes, I have pushed processes in Brussels dialogue. We reached 33 agreements. Why? Not that we were willing to do agreements, but I was pushing, even saying to EU, please put European standards as the basis for solution, otherwise things are not moving. So now to come to the end to this, where we are. First, Serbia knows that there is chapter 35 that we established, myself with Americans, and Serbia knows that it cannot reach to the European Union without normalizing relations with Kosovo, because chapter 35 applied to Serbia as a decision of EU calls that there is going to be normalization of relations between two states with the judicially obliged agreement for two sides, but honestly to say, nobody is mentioning. All is about Kosovo. Yes, Kosovo has to implement its obligation based on Kosovo constitutions, but Serbia has also to recognize Kosovo de jure. Otherwise, this Brussels dialogue, as it is 10 years, might be another 10 and 20 years, unfortunately, because Brussels is quite a slow motion mediator. If there was no United States in Rambouillet, we would not have what we have today alive. We would be all killed with Milosevic genocide. And I am saying several times, it's time on EU, to be fair, to say, yes, UN Assembly asked EU to facilitate the dialogue, should say, please, US, take the seat of mediator and become the mediator. We become your supporters, because after all these new challenges we are having, especially the events between Iran and Israel, things are going beyond even best experts are imagining. So I would say at least Balkans to fix this issue, and this is the big exchange. Yeta, sorry, didn't speak about women issues. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to briefly say that while I acknowledge and appreciate that, this administration is not prepared to take the place of the European Union as the lead facilitators of the dialogue.
Thank you both for your interventions. I disagree with you, Madame Tahiri, saying that you were not talking about women's rights. I think you were acting as a woman in peace negotiations and in peace building. So you were exactly talking about that. So thank you. And last but not least, I will go back to Melisa because we are beyond time, but I want to give her the second round and to. Now, I'm scared to ask a question because usually in the second round I ask questions, but they were not very much answered. So in any case, I will go to the point of how can we ensure that more women are in these processes, and how you did give an example, your own example of breaking barriers, but what are your thoughts? What can you share at this point after hearing all the speakers?
I promise I'll be very brief. So in practical terms, I think that first and foremost, we should celebrate the trailblazers, the women who were there before there was peace in Kosovo. So the women who fought for freedom, who fought for political rights as a prerequisite for peace, and then who are fighting today for peace as a prerequisite for democracy. So Kosovo's modern history goes back to a lot far than the 21st century. So in the 90s, we, for example, had Ülfete Humoli, who was killed as a 17-year-old kid, if I may, teenager, while protesting for political rights. We have Madame Dr. Flora Brovina here in the audience as well. Also as a political activist, a humanitarian activist who was held hostage as a prisoner of war and held in prison in Serbia for 2 years, and she was released only after international pressure after the war. We also have Madame Edita Tahiri, not least, and also Madame Ativete Yahyaga, and now President Osmani, who is the most voted politician in Kosovo. So quotas have become, if I may, useless now because the Kosovo society, in cooperation with the international community, were able to build the confidence and to see that women in politics and women in peace processes are the ones who bring results, are the ones who broker agreements, and are the ones who implement as well those agreements and not leave them only on paper. And the second thing, if I may, is also the necessity to apply gender quotas in Kosovo's foreign service. And I use this podium. Now we don't have the Prime Minister here nor the President, but I'm sure they will hear this plea from this podium here to the plea to apply gender quotas to Kosovo's foreign service and to take all the legal means to implement the gender quotas to Kosovo's diplomatic service as well. Thank you.
Now, I don't know, add 2 minutes really, because I see Dora.
Yes, sure. Very good. I agree fully with Melisa, what she just said. And as a sort of political topic emerged here, and Edita's expert remarks about the association, just to quickly say what's different about the association, and again, in and of itself, giving some special rights to a group, in and of itself, depending on how the design is, and that's critical, is not a bad thing. But what's different about the association from elsewhere in the region, for example, in Croatia, I mentioned the Erdut Agreement, and the Joint Council of Serb majority municipalities in Croatia. The difference, what was the difference? In that case, the Croatian Serbs relinquished any bid that they would have to Eastern Slavonia to somehow secede, And it was similar with Belgrade, even though there wasn't formal recognition at that time. But this was, and without that, that's the basic trade of autonomy, is a vulnerable group, a vulnerable minority gets autonomy, a form of autonomy, a carefully structured, from the central government in exchange for relinquishing any possibility of any type of territorial secession or otherwise obstruction of the kind we see with Republika Srpska and Milorad Dodik every day. So, and I know Ambassador Hovenier and the Biden administration are very aware of that concern, but that's what's different about this case. Kosovo makes this deal. Kosovo does not have the all-important pathway to NATO, which is all-important not just for Kosovo, but for Serbia and the entire region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Please join me in a round of applause, and we will leave the floor for the next panel. Thank you very much.